Is there anyone in the Islamic regime in Iran that is willing to negotiate with President Trump, accept some of his conditions, and show some flexibility? As the military operations continue in Iran, many people are asking whether there's going to be a diplomatic end to the operations. As I predicted and I mentioned to you many times, people like Ghalibaf and even the entirety of the IRGC, without Ali Khamenei, are now only answerable to regime supporters. And without Ali Khamenei holding them back, they have no tolerance for any form of, as they call it, compromise. And we just saw, for example, the so called reformer Javad Zarif and also Hassan Rouhani, another so called reformer, the response they got from the regime supporters when they were trying to find a way to show some flexibility and maybe get to a ceasefire. The regime supporters, as we predicted, responded very harshly, asking for their arrest and execution by the IRGC, by the judiciary branch. And this is really key to understand because a lot of people are now looking for, oh, who is it that we could talk to within the Islamic Republic? If Ghalibaf is not going to compromise or show any flexibility, is there anyone else? The problem with looking for anyone else comes from a lack of understanding on whether or not the people who are flexible are even able to, even if they wanted to, are they able to have any influence over what the IRGC does? Let's look at the most flexible people here, the ones that they call moderates or reformers. And these are people including Hassan Rouhani, Javad Zarif, Hassan Khomeini, Muhammad Khatami. It is true that these people are desperate to show some flexibility. And again, their motivations is not to save Iran or anything like that. For them, this is an opportunity to signal to President Trump that, pick me, I'm the guy that you want. I honestly think that Javad Zarif's article was even a signal to President Trump to kill Ghalibaf and other people and pick him and his camp as the leaders of the Islamic Republic. And their vision is to save the Islamic Republic, but with their leadership. But that's not going to work. Because imagine if that happened. Imagine if we got rid of all the people, all the most influential people within the Beit Rahbari, loyal to the supreme leadership, the remaining highest officials of IRGC, Ghalibaf, AJE. Imagine if we took all of them and now we had only the reformers. How are they going to control the Islamic Republic? Remember, I go back to this again. There are three sources of political power: economic, military, and people power. The reformers have none of that. Right now, military power and economic power mostly belongs to IRGC. When it comes to people power, among the minority supporters of the regime, the reformers have none of it. The reformers are the most bankrupt when it comes to the level of support from the Iranian people because anti-regime people hate them with a passion and pro-regime people also hate them with a passion. The reformist, moderate politicians in the Islamic Republic are the most hated ones. They have managed to unite the most number of Iranians in hating them. The anti-regime people hate them because Ali Khamenei has successfully used them as scapegoat every time the Islamic Republic was demonstrated to be weak and pathetic, to the point that it was even obvious to the regime supporters. Ali Khamenei just used the reformers as a way to not get any blame himself. The reformers knew that's what they were being used for, and they went with it anyways because Ali Khamenei gave them some economic favors and some other favors for agreeing to be his shield here and there. But the effect of that over the years has been that the regime supporters not only see these reformers as the source of most of their problems, in fact, they see them as treasonous and spies for Israel and the United States. And now without Ali Khamenei holding them back, they want their execution. But the anti-regime people hate them as well with a passion because the anti-regime people correctly have identified them as fake opposition to the regime and a pressure release valve and the reason for why the Islamic Republic has managed to continue surviving all of these decades. From the anti-regime perspective, at least with the so-called hardliners, because they're all hardliners, but at least with the people who are usually identified as hardliners, what you see is what you get. With the so-called reformers or moderates, they're more cunning, they're more clever with their politics, and that's why the anti-regime people hate them with the passion, because in their mind, they have managed to fool so many people over the years into supporting them and therefore supporting the Islamic regime. But now more Iranian people are aware of this trick and they always chant that they're never going to fall for this ever again. So given that these so-called reformers have very little economic power, they have some, but not enough, very little military power because the IRGC hates them as well, and given that they are the most bankrupt when it comes to people power, they don't even have the support of regime supporters. There's basically nothing they could do if you put them in charge. If, for example, the Americans pick them and put them in charge because they're more flexible, once you leave, they will be torn apart from all sides. So let's imagine this. Imagine if the Americans and Israelis got rid of the third layer of leadership within the Islamic Republic, and now we're left with some of these reformers, and we're like, hey, let's talk to them. The first problem is going to be, how are these reformers are going to be able to have any influence over what the IRGC does? The conflict between people like Rouhani and IRGC goes back years. So it's really hard to imagine IRGC commanders taking orders from somebody like Zarif or Rouhani. But even if by some miracle, for their own survival's sake, let's say they do that, the problem is, how are they going to sell that to the regime supporters, which they need, by the way, because without them, the level of support for the regime would get close to 0%. And even tyrants will not be able to continue to rule with 0% support. But let's try to imagine that happens. The reformers are now in charge. Somehow they managed to be in charge of IRGC, and IRGC is now somehow taking commands from the people that they hate the most. And the regime followers have to just accept that because they're unarmed. So they just have to take it. And we now have a ceasefire, and the Americans go home, and Israel is also forced to limit its operations because the Americans are not there anymore. What happens then? Do you think the Iranians are just going to sit back and be like, oh, I guess Rouhani is now our supreme leader, and Javad Zarif is I don't know what? You might tell me that, Armin, the Iranian people will be forced to accept that because they will be shot if they don't. Here's the thing. I don't really see the current regime supporters, the Basijis, the current volunteers that we're seeing in the streets, in the checkpoints, the Maddos, the religious vocalists, the state TV, and all of the other propaganda apparatus of the regime coming out and defending Rouhani and Zarif against an uprising. If anything, I would be expecting a double uprising once the Americans leave. A large secular uprising against the regime, and another, in parallel, a minority jihadi uprising against the regime as well. So if you somehow manage to put the so-called reformers in charge, that would be a very unstable situation that would have to eventually collapse into one of two more stable situations. One would be that eventually the more jihadi, Islamic-minded, pro-Khamenei side being able to gain control back again. That's one option. And get rid of these reformers. That's one option. And another option would be that the majority secular-minded Iranian people will be able to gain control and get rid of the reformers. So this would be a temporary phase that we would be in. And the jihadi minority side would have the advantage of being more armed, and the more secular-minded side would have the advantage of being much higher in numbers. And again, as I mentioned in my previous video, we might be able to change the balance more in favor of the more secular, the majority secular-minded Iranians by arming and training them with not just guns, but guns and drones. Remember, that requires a lot of vetting and a lot of training. We don't want to just randomly release guns on the population, not knowing where this is going to go. Now you have a much better understanding when it comes to the complications of finding anybody to talk to, if that is actually the goal. If you want to talk to me about this in more detail, check the link in the description to our discussion group. I'm there almost every day. Also, let me know in the comment section if you found this helpful. I'm reading a lot of your comments, and the ones that tell me that these are educational and helpful is really motivating me to make more videos like this. My name is Armin Navabi. I'm Israel Chai. Long live America. Javid Shah. Payande Iran.